Well, good morning.
Good morning.
And it is always good to have you with us if you're online. Hope you can get back to be with us soon. So I'm like Rick, some days I forget to welcome everyone. It's good to see a classroom full of people after Rick taught, and we had kind of a smaller crowd last week because y'all knew I was coming back. So we laughed about. So, but how many of you saw agitators this week after last week's lesson? How many of you ran into agitators last week and realized that you're an agitator? Actually, I didn't say it out loud to some kids. I still thought it. So I was curious if anybody else ran into people last week and thought, I need to pray for you because you're an agitator. So it is good to have everybody here today. I'm glad we all survived the wind yesterday. I hope it didn't cause any damages at your homes. I've seen pictures. It was bad up north, but I'm not sure if we had quite as much wind as y'all did here because I didn't see the dirt quite the same as y'all did. So, but it was, I don't know, it was bad. But we stayed inside and watched a little basketball. If you're a Tech fan, that was kind of a nice win. It's unexpected at the end. So anyway, we'll get busy today. Today, I want to ask you, how many of you have heard, and when you have, what this phrase brings to your mind? The phrase faith over fear. That seems to have been quite a common phrase in 2020, faith over fear. What does that, when you hear that phrase, what does it make you think of?
God.
Okay, God. And what about God?
He's in control.
He is.
He's got it. He's got it.
What else? Is there anything else? I mean, does it bring anything specific to mind, or is it just kind of in general a statement? Or
Trust.
trust? Yes, very much so. It involves trust. And I agree that it makes me think, put God over things, let God be in control, let God have, turn it over to God, those types of things. But I think what you're saying is a huge part of it. It's developing a sense of trust within ourselves. And it's being able to not depend on us, but depend on God. What was that? Why was that so popular this year, do you think? It's an easy one. So.
Yeah.
Fear of COVID and have faith in God and don't let between the government and COVID and shutdown and everything else that was going on. You have to have faith in God.
It's a hard thing to actually do it. It's an easy thing to say it, but it's a hard thing to do it. And I catch myself, you try to live by faith. We've all talked about that, I'm sure, through our lives. But when you start trying to live by faith, you realize that when you're actually trying to do it, I think it's a lot harder than when you're just talking about it. So, I think 2020 probably tested a lot of people because there were so many things, so many years, there may be one thing in your life that you're really having to deal with, and you've got to give that to God. But y'all just rattled off 3 or 4 or 5 things like that we faced last year. And so I think that this term or this lesson today, I think it's very applicable to our lives today because faith over fear is a big thing. There's a lot of fear right now. We pray for our country. We do that a lot anyway, I think, as a people, especially in the South. I don't know why. I've heard it a lot. But I've heard more.
Support the North.
Yeah. But, I think maybe a lot of that comes from being agricultural people, too, in this part of the country and just having to have faith over that.
Yeah, what about the rain we got this week?
Yes, we got almost an inch. Yes, sir.
Inch and a quarter.
Oh, well, we had almost an inch, so that was good. Yes, sir.
Well, I was thinking about that faith over fear. The word tells us that we're God's workmanship created to do his good works. And so if you have a purpose, like Dale talked about last Sunday's sermon, those are the things you're not going to let hold you back. You may order food online and have that shipped to your house. But these things are the things that I was unwilling to wait on. But then people would say, well, what about being wise about this and that? And I said, I'm not going to leave this earth 1 second sooner than I was appointed to, whether it was by COVID or a truck hit me out on 19th Street. I'm not concerned about that. But I am concerned about, am I doing my purpose?
Yes.
But I got a lot of looks for that, so.
Well, you know, it's, when you start talking about faith, of course, I think one of the dangers we get into, and this is, I'm already off track, but one of the dangers we get into is that I'll catch myself going, well, I got to live by faith, but I still have to do the things that I know are smart or that are intelligent or that are common sense. I can't just run out there and stand in front of a truck and think God's going to let me pass through the truck because of my faith. So, you know, I mean, there's a certain mixture of common sense and faith, and I do believe that God gives us that common sense so that, you know, there's a purpose for that too. But in the end, we have to believe that whether our common sense holds us up or not, whether our decisions hold us up or not, that God's going to take care of us. And I think that's where that real faith comes from. And you're right. If we know our purpose, then we just go about our purpose. And if God decides it's our time, then it's our time. So, you know, and again, I'm way off base already. Y'all do good job. So, my history classes do this to me every once in a while. But, you know, I've had some conversations this week about that very thing, about faith and about, you know, if it's your time to go, or we were talking about some people that were fearing death, and I was talking to a Christian about it, and they were talking about how afraid they were to pass away. And I said, you know, I don't know why we've allowed ourselves to come to that, because I know the early Christians talked about, they prayed for God to come and, or for them to be able to go be with him. And, you know, sometimes I think we forget that when we pass away, it's better than it is here, because we get so caught up in the trappings of what we have and the comforts that we have. And we forget that, you know, yes, it's hard for us to watch someone else go, but I always enjoy going to a funeral where it's a celebration, because we realize that, I hate to say I always enjoy going to a funeral, but if you go to a funeral, it's a much better funeral to go to if we realize this person had a great relationship with God. It was obvious in everything they did, and we're very confident that that person has gotten to be with his creator or her creator, and so it's a celebration. And I think that that's one of the things that as humans, and Americans especially, maybe because we are so blessed, that we forget. And you know, sometimes we need to celebrate those things. But I'm going to stray back to the lesson here. So we've already talked about a lot of examples, so let's just jump into today's lesson. It's taken from Numbers, chapters 13 and 14. And this is a story that I think everybody is probably fairly familiar with. You may not know all the details. You may not remember all the details. Numbers 13 and 14. And we'll start, well, let's talk a little bit about background. When we get to Numbers 13, we're going to talk about the story of the 12 spies. So most of you are familiar with that story, but what do you know leads up to this? So what is the setting for this story? The 12 spies that go in and they canvass the promised land, and they come back with their report. Before all of that happens, what do we know? What has led up to this point? What do you remember? Any of it? And you can flip through the chapters and look at the headings. It's okay.
Well, they've wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. They're finally at that point where they can go in. But they send people in, 12 scouts, to go and see what is there and bring back and show the people what they waited, what they had been promised.
So I'm going to correct you just a little bit, because this is exactly what I thought when I started reading, and then I went back and read. They had wandered in the wilderness, but how long had they wandered up to that point? Only 2 years. Yeah, it's just a little over 2 years. They had gone from Egypt to the edge of the promised land. And this episode is why they wandered for 40.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of the same frame. I thought, man, they've been wandering for 40 years, and they get to this place, and they've been through 40 years with God in the wilderness. And how do they? It's been 2. 2.5, possibly 3. But we're in a fairly, I mean, let's be honest, 2 years of wandering in the wilderness is a long time. But yeah, especially with that many people. So that's kind of what leads up to this. They've been through, but what kind of things have the Israelites seen over those 2.5 to 3 years? He fed them. How did he feed them?
Manna every day.
Manna every day. How else did he feed them?
Well,
He provided some meat for them too, didn't he? So he has, if nothing else, he has fed them every day, faithfully, consistently for years. And he's provided water from rocks.
and their shoes didn't wear out.
And their clothes, their shoes didn't wear out. That's right. Wandering in the desert for the wilderness for that long, their shoes didn't wear out. What else have they seen? He guided them. He had the clouds by day and the pillar of fire by night. Had the parting of the Red Sea. Do we need any more? That's 2 years worth of stuff. Apparently we do. That's right. Because as we look in this story today, we're going to see about where their faith stood. And you know, I don't know about y'all. For me, I have a tendency to be real judgmental on biblical characters. And I don't know why, because had I wandered through the wilderness for 2 years and I'd seen God do all these miracles for me, I think, man, I'd have been gung-ho and said, God can do anything.
But that applies to today.
There you go. But then I start thinking about my life and I think, man, how many awesome and wonderful things has God done in my life and around me for people that I know. I mean, that's, you know, just the incredible things he's done for us. And how do I still have a tendency to decide that I think I know better than God? That you know what, God, I got this one. I don't need your help on it. How many times do we do that? Oh, this is an easy one. I got this one. I pray all the time on the hard ones, but the easy ones, yeah, I don't want to mess. I don't have to bother you. I don't want to interrupt. But I think we kind of have a tendency to get into that mode. But so anyway, I was curious if I'm the only one that's really hard on the Israelites, because I think these guys are just not very smart. You know, what does it take to convince you? You saw walls of water in an ocean with dry ground, and you walked across it, and you still don't believe God can deliver you from anything?
Well, we don't let him finish is what he wants for us. We're too big of a hurry to get done. I want it now.
That is correct. We're very much, and I think that's funny because we know today we're an automatic society, aren't we? An instant society. And if you listen to your grandparents and your parents and my parents, they'll tell us that, oh, y'all are so impatient. Back in our day, and you get the stories of of course, I mean, actually, some of us lived a little bit of it, the pre-electronic days, and you had to read a book. Ooh, that took a while. You didn't just watch it. And, you know, you couldn't just throw your food into this little square box and have it ready in about 35 seconds. You had to actually cook every meal that you wanted to eat. And all of those types of things, the idea of patience and what you're talking about, the idea that we're going to let God do things in his time. We're just an instant society, aren't we? We want it, and we want it now. That's my money, and I want it now. I think that's the commercial. And that's how it is. So, we know the things they've seen, and yet we know, even before we read the story, because we've read it before, what their faith does to them here. So let's go ahead and get into the story. I'm just going to read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 13 real quickly. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a leader among them. So what does God tell Moses to do in these two verses? What's he telling him? And let me rephrase that. I don't want to say to do. What is he telling Moses in these two verses?
Find a leader in each group.
Okay, find a leader. So he's actually, of course, they've already done this. He's already had his, 70 men that have been appointed to help him, because he's begged God for some help, because this is too great a burden for one man. And so God has let his spirit come upon 70 leaders. So he's telling you now, pick one leader from each tribe. I need 12 men. 12 good men that you trust. So he's not picking like just whoever, is he? These are supposed to be 12 of the best he's got. All right, what else is God telling him in these two verses?
He's giving them the land.
Say it again.
He's giving them the land.
The most important thing God says in this is not send 12 men, but it's send 12 men to look at what?
What I'm giving.
What I am giving you. So he doesn't make this is not a scout it out to see what we're going to have to fight mission. This is a go see what you're getting so you come back and tell everybody what we're fixing to take. I'm giving this to you. And I think sometimes we get to reading this story and we think, oh, Moses had to make these great military plans. And so they were going to try to figure out how they were going to attack. And they needed to go scout out the land and people to know, what would be the best place to attack. And when I read these two verses, I don't get that. Because this is God telling him, go look at the land, send them out. And he gives them some specifics in verses, here in a little bit we'll read. He tells them what to look for. And it is possibly so that they feel better about their military plans and things. But he tells them in verse 2, the land I am going to give to you. And I think that's a big statement before he ever starts this whole thing. And it should have set the tone for how this scouting went. So let's read. We're going to skip the names of the men he chose just for time's sake. And we're going to move over to verse 17. So if I could get someone to read verses 17 through 33. It's a fairly long reading, but it's the story of what happens here. 17 through 33.
This is chapter 13,
Yes, sir. Thank you.
verse 17. When Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. See what the land is like and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees or in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. It was the season of the first ripe grapes. So they went, So they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob toward Lake Lebo Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshaiah, and Tamiah, the descendants of Anak, lived. Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off the branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster of grapes and the Israelites cut off there. At the end of the 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. When we went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack these people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them.
Thank you very much for reading that. So we get the story here of what actually happened. And let's look at it a little at a time. And the first thing is, we talked about this is a information gathering trip. They're going in to spy it out. I've had people talk about how do you think they did that? Did they split up and go by twos? Did they travel as a pack? Did they hide themselves? Did they go in as they were businessmen? I mean, what, how did they go in and go about their spying? Or did they do it like we think of, where they hid and nobody ever saw them and they just kind of looked? We're not given that information, are we? Is it important? Must not be. Because what is important is what they brought back. So let's look real quick at what Moses asked them to do. We talked about it being an information gathering thing. As you read verses 17 through 20, what specifics did Moses ask them to bring back? What questions did he say we need to answer? There were a lot of questions about the people. What were some of those questions?
Whether they're strong or weak.
Are they strong or are they weak? So are we looking at an easy, and so in the minds of men, what does that mean? I was about to answer my own question. In the minds of men, what does that mean? Are they strong or weak?
Can we find?
Yeah, is this going to be easy or is this going to be tough? Is this going to be hard? So he asked that. What else did he ask about the people?
How many of them are?
Yeah, are there many or are there few? So are we able to do, how many men do we know? Does anybody remember from the first 13 verses of Numbers where they're giving us numbers after number, after, all the different statistics? Do you remember how many men, fighting men of age 20 and over, I think, to fight were with the Israelites? Does anybody remember that number off the top of your head? I mean, I would not have, so I'm not trying to, come on. I haven't been up here teaching this to you for weeks. There's over 600,000 men of fighting age and ability with the group. I think the numbers, if you add up all the numbers from each tribe, it was like 630,000, something like that, men. And so, are they many or are they few? How many of our people are we going to have to send in to do the job? So that was one of them. Are they many or are they few? What kind of specific questions did he ask about the land?
Is it good or bad? Is
Yes.
it worth fighting for?
Is it good or bad? And when they ask, is it good or bad? What could that mean?
Is the land rich?
Is it rich? Is it fertile? And it actually asks later on, is it rich or poor? But
Fertile, are there trees?
yeah, it asks about forest. Are there trees? Are there forests there? When we say good or bad, though, like we're from West Texas. So that puts a different perspective on it, doesn't it? Because when I moved, my career, I've lived in not Austin, San Antonio, Corpus, Canton on the other side of Dallas, Wichita Falls. I haven't lived anywhere outside of Texas, but I've lived all over Texas. And the people in East Texas, especially on the other side of Dallas, when I lived in Canton, world's biggest flea market, yes. So, well, I'm over there, and people would, literally look at us, and Tina knows this. They'd say, "You really like West Texas? Have you driven to Colorado?" Yes, I have. Have you driven to New Mexico and driven through there? Yes, I have. And yes, I can see the next city at night from 30 miles away. And yes, I can, as a college student driving between Andrews, Texas and Lubbock, Texas, I did take my hands off the steering wheel and see how far I can go without having to touch it. I think the furthest I ever got was about 1.2 miles before my car drifted. But, yes, I do know what it's like, but they just look at you with this sense of, you're nuts. Because my definition of what is good may be different from theirs. I like the fact that if my teenage sons drive off the road, they've got a shoulder and then dirt and a barbed wire fence, not trees everywhere. So, there are things that you look at, and so each individual's version of what is good and bad may be different. So I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but we did know he asked if it was rich or poor. We can obviously believe that it was for fertility. Is the land going to be good for crops? Is it going to be good for our livestock? Is it going to be a good place to, are there forests so that you have wood to build things with? Is it mountainous? Is it valleys? Is there water? Is there good water? Because obviously we know in that day and age, that was a huge thing. Having good clean water, especially in the Middle East. And so, anyway, so we asked him about that. And then he asked about cities. What did he ask about the cities themselves? This kind of goes back to the people, but what did he ask about the cities? Yeah, are they fortified or not? Because what does that mean?
It'll be hard, we're gonna have to fight.
How are we going to have to fight them? Are we going to have to put the city under siege? Are we going to be able to just roll in through the city because there are no walls? You know, what are we looking at when we get ready to go in? So he asked all these questions, and he sends them out. And so these 12 men come back, and we get into verses, and Kyle, thank you for reading 21 through about 23, because that's just all those names, and that's why we skipped, honestly, all the names of the men. But they come back, and what do they have? What do they tell? And remember now, when they first come back, who do they go to? Do they come back and just spill it in front of everybody? No, they come back and it says the people that were gathered with Moses. So we don't know exactly who that is. Best guesses are those 70 men that have been anointed with the Spirit, that have helped him to lead. And you've got this leadership group, and these 12 men come back in and report to them. What do they bring and what do they report?
It is flowing with milk and honey and not fruit.
Okay, God did not lie to us. This land is flowing with milk and honey. And as proof, they did what he asked them to do. They brought back some of the fruits of the land. Yes, ma'am.
Well, what I was looking at, that kind of opens your mind up, since they were huge people, they were giants. And they're talking about bringing a cluster of grapes on a pole. I would think everything would be gigantic there. Doesn't that?
So what you're saying reminds me, and I don't, you know, y'all have seen these things, the little children's Bibles. Have y'all ever seen this scene illustrated? And they've got there's a picture that's just stuck in my mind, and they've got the pole, and the grapes are like basketballs. And I'm not sure that's exactly what we're talking about. I think you're talking about a huge cluster of grapes that was heavy. And, you know, I mean, they may have been big grapes, but, you know, I don't know, maybe ping pong size balls. But those pictures in that, you know, the little children's illustrated book, they're like basketballs with it's a whole meal. You know? Yeah, and, you know, they talk about giants, and we know for a fact who did David fight? Goliath. And it talks about the fact that there were these descendants of Anak, who was a part of the Nephilim. And if you read about all that, study about all that, there's, you know, so many, we're not going to go down that trail. But there were giants in the land. And so there were some extremely large people. Now they make it sound like, though, what?
Make it sound like
They're all the giants. Oh, we've seen it. And all the people, and we're like grasshoppers. So they come back with it's a little bit of a mixed report, isn't it? Because they are coming back saying really good things about the land. They're coming back saying, look how rich it is. Look at these grapes. Look at these pomegranates and these figs. It is a very fruitful land. But then they start heading down that road that you're talking about. Well, they've got giants. They're big people. Their cities are well fortified. And as they head down that pathway, who interrupts them? Caleb. Caleb says, wait a minute, let's just go do it right now. He doesn't even talk about the land. He doesn't say, hey, I know they're big, but he doesn't say, hey, yes, it's great land, but he says, hey, let's go do it. He tries to totally change the attitude of what's being done, because as he's listening, as he's watching, you can see that this is going into a negative direction. Well, yeah, it's all that great stuff, but, and then out comes the doubt, right? So all of a sudden, the faith is starting to disappear. And Caleb is you know, a positive person. He says, wait, we can do this. Yes, ma'am.
They're instigators.
They are. Maybe it goes back to last week's lesson. I don't know. Maybe some of these men wanted to agitate, but that's exactly what I was about to say. So we know that he picked 12 good men, at least what they thought were 12 good men, right? We have a tendency to go, oh, those 10 guys, they were dogs. They went down there and didn't have any faith. These are 12 men that were supposed to be leaders. They had faith in these 12 men. But these 10 of them, at least, turned out to be maybe too human, right? Because when they came back, they placed their fear, which is what you're talking about. They start putting this fear out there. They place their fear, their insecurities, their lack of belief in God before their trust and their faith in God. And so they come back and they forget. And one of the things, the question I want to ask you is, when those men said, we, and of course then they go from Moses and then they get out amongst the people and start to kind of spread. But they're saying, we can't do this. Who are they saying? Who are we?
Well, they were exactly right.
They were exactly right. Caleb, on the other hand, he said, we can go do this now. Who's Caleb talking about?
God.
Yeah, us with the help of God. God will do it through us. God can do this. We can do this. The other 10 are going, we can't do this. And they're talking about the people, the Israelites. And I think there's that may seem kind of small in the picture, but it's also like verse 2 says, God told them, I'm going to give this to you. And I think somehow they overlooked that statement. I think sometimes we overlook who they were talking about in this. When they say we, they're talking about different people. They're talking about Caleb and Joshua are talking about the people with God. God will do the work and they'll be able to do it. The 10 spies were saying we, and they're talking about us, the people. People in this room, we can't do it. If we had to go do something like that, we know we couldn't do it. But if God told us we could walk out that door with the assurance that we could. Now, would we walk out that door with the assurance that we could? That's where I think my dad used to talk about a saying I never, as a kid, the rubber meets the road, right? When we go out that door, that's where it counts. And that's where these men were. So these men, these 10, they didn't trust. They didn't trust enough. They didn't have strong enough faith. And they made a mistake that is a common mistake. How many of you have at your position, at your job, at your workplace, at least a small leadership group? So I want you to kind of think about that. If you don't, think about it at church, where there is a fairly small leadership group. Most congregations have a fairly small leadership group, whether it's a congregation of 200 that have 4 or 5 people that are really the core leaders of that group, or a congregation this size that has, I don't know, how many elders do we have? 16, 15, in the teens. But still, when you consider the size of the congregation, what is our attendance? Our membership? Do they know?
1,400 coming 19.
1,400. So we're talking about 15 men. You're talking about one for approximately every 100 people. That's a pretty small group, isn't it? When you're in a small group and you're making decisions, and I know this is how it has been everywhere I've been in my life, and I've been on coaching staff, so that's what I use for my example. We get in meetings and we yell at each other. We do. And unfortunately, I've been called lots of names by my best friends, because that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. We're going to lose if we do that. But when we open the doors and we walk out of that meeting, all 7, 8, 9, 10 of us, however many coaches there were, and we stood in front of our team, what did we do? We all said the same things, because we agreed before we got out the doors, okay, here's the plan. Well, I don't get the sense that when these 10 left, they remembered that. Because when these 10 left, they went out among the people in verses, as Kyle read in 31 through 33, they start doing what?
We can't without doubts.
Yeah, they spread it. We can't. They spread out. What were you going to say?
They said they stopped and thought about it a little bit more, and kind of backpedaled a little bit, said this way a little bit, see.
Probably one of those fear factor.
And that's how it usually works, isn't it? You've got one that kind of drives it, and the others go ahead and take it. Yes, sir?
I think I try to keep in mind it takes faith, trust, and obedience in everything I do, because those all work. Like are you walking out the door with the assurance that he is who he says he is? I'm trusting, I'm having the faith to do it. I'm obedient, I'm gonna go do it, and go provide. But those are hard to keep in focus.
It is, and as humans, I think if we can get past the first part that you're talking about, the faith, having the faith in it, having the trust in it, when we walk out the door, is that obedience to the point of, it's the completeness of your trust. When you go out and your actions show your faith. So I go out and actually do the things that show that my faith is strong. And I think you're exactly right. Those things all tie together. And when they got out of their big meeting, their smaller meeting, they went out amongst their fellow Israelites and started talking. And apparently, there must not have been an agreement reached in this meeting that was, hey, because I don't think Moses would have said, yeah, go out and tell everybody what you just told us. I don't see how that would be the case. But they do. They go out and they start spreading it. So we're not going to read it because the 14th chapter is a long chapter. So we're just going to kind of work our way through it as you go. You may want to look at it. Verses 1 through 10. Actually, let's read verses 1 through 10. I'm going to do that real quick. So all the congregation, we're in chapter 14, verses 1 through 10. So all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and people wept that night. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. But Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. So we get into verses 1 through 10, and this is spreading. What happens when you have negativity in a group? What does it usually do? It spreads like wildfire. That's right. And this one spread fast because they come out during the day and they give this report to all the people, and it says, what did they do all night?
Cried.
They cried and wept. Oh, and you can just hear it. I mean, I can just hear it in my, we spent all this time in the desert and the wilderness, and we got here. And then he starts telling us exactly what they're saying, doesn't he? So I don't have to imagine. What does he tell? What did they say in starting in verse 2? If only what?
Go back to Egypt.
If we'd just died in Egypt, this whole thing had been over. It'd have been so much better. What else? If we died where?
In the wilderness.
Okay, so you got us out of Egypt. That was great. We don't have to be slaves anymore. But then we could have just died in the wilderness. It would have been so much easier. Now we're going to have to go in here and get, destroyed by these giants. Why has the Lord brought us in this land to fall by the sword? And not only that, they go to the fear factor, right? This is what you're talking about, Sonny. They go to the fear factor. You hear this all the time. When people want to really instill fear, they invoke what? Women and children. The women and children are going to get taken. And they're going to kill all the men and use the women and children for slave labor and for their pleasure. So they're going to be victims. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they're more for, as a group, to go back into slavery than they are to trust God, who has brought them this far, to go into this land that is so abundant and so rich. And we had this conversation, not this conversation, but I talked about this last week, that I've got a friend that used to say, individuals are smart and people are stupid. And that's what this is, isn't it? It's that, we talked about it last week, mob mentality, where you get those agitators. And these 10 became those agitators we talked about last week. These 10 stirred it up. They went out and spoke poorly and negatively, and it spread among the people. And we talked about this before. What happens in churches when that happens?
But usually fire the preacher.
Usually a preacher gets fired. There's a split possibly over it. And when preachers get fired, so often you lose people, don't you? Because that preacher's people, the ones that loved him and liked him and thought he was a great teacher, get offended and they leave. Or I've been in a congregation where we had to vote. And I thought, that's just going to split the congregation. And it did for a while. Because you had to place a vote. Are we going to get rid of him or are we going to keep him? Because there were no elders. We were in a situation where there were no elders. So that decision was not, it was made by the congregation. And it caused hurt feelings, and we lost people over that. But negativity leads to, so usually you lose preachers, you lose elders step down because they feel like maybe they haven't done their job well. But negativity leads to negative outcomes. That's just,
It totally distracts everybody from the mission. And that's what's happened here. They get 630,000 fighting men, but these guys never fought a battle. Exodus 14:14, Moses told them, stand here, and today you'll see the Lord fight for you. Why? They've been in captivity, they never fought a battle. They didn't know. And it's the same thing here. They're afraid. And maybe we would be too. Yes. But is faith over fear? Is that a slogan? Is that a bumper sticker or a chariot sticker for them? Or is it something you really believe? And yeah, I know you go in because you're the Caleb. There's a guy who said, hey, we can do this. Caleb and Joshua. But they're not supposed to be the spokesperson anyhow.
that is,
Moses is the spokesperson.
that is correct.
He didn't
Well,
say,
well,
go
the
tell me.
bottom line, the Lord is. In verse 22, it says, let's see, he says, he wrought all these, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I wrought in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to proof these 10 times, have hearkened to my voice. You know, if we saw the things that God had done, they saw all those signs in Egypt. And he had done, so I don't know what all he did in the wilderness, but I have to go back and read it all.
We listed a bunch of them, didn't we?
Yeah. Yeah, and yet they didn't believe. And you know what? Just before all this, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses, and he gave them leprosy.
He did. He stuck
And
Miriam
she was
outside
out
the
of the-
camp for 7 days.
She was out of the camp for 7 days. They knew about that.
Yes, everybody did. And you're right, it goes back to they forgot what the focus was, which is what you were talking about, Jerry, where they forgot their purpose. They forgot. They got in. You got ahead of me, but that's okay because that's where we're going. So for the next 10 verses here, 12, from 11 through 20, God talks to Moses and says what? You know what? I'm done. I'm done with these people. I'm going to make a nation out of you. Well, I'll keep my promise to Abraham, but I'm going to do it through you. And then he goes on and he lists all these grievances against the people. And we're not going to read through every one of those grievances. But he does what you just said. He said, you know, hey, they have forgotten what I've done for them. They aren't trusting in me. I'm done. I'm going to disinherit these people. And what does Moses do? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So the question I have is, did they ever trust God? Because they rebelled through him the whole time since they left Egypt. Even on Mount Sinai, they built a golden calf. Did they ever really trust in God? So this deal that we're talking about is nothing new for the Israelites.
No, it's not. And I know that I did some reading leading up to this, and apparently there was a group of people that came with the Israelites that escaped Egypt with them. And I had forgotten that. But there were apparently a large number of people that had left Egypt with them that were non-believers. They were non-Jewish people. And it even addresses that and says, you've got to send them out of the camp for a minute here so we can have this conversation. Because he was afraid that their grumbling was going to affect or infect, whichever term you want to use, the rest of the Jews. And so we do know that it's not just the Jews either. And, you know, let's be honest, they've been in slavery for 400 years. Maybe their faith was a little weak. Maybe they didn't believe he was going to go ahead and take it. Maybe they had such negative lives that the 2 years was not enough to erase the 400 years of history of slavery and mistreatment. I mean, not to go political here, because I try not to do that much, but I mean, we still have people in the United States that are trying to get reparations for what happened only 150 years ago, right? And they're not talking about a 400-year past. They're talking, I mean, and this is way out in the future. These people had just left it. They had just left the slavery. So there are probably not a lot of leaders among them. You know, you're right. And so when you look at them, I think that their faith is probably, I don't know the term for it, maybe like young faith. They're beginning to grow, but with a young Christian, it's pretty easy to have setbacks. And I would think it's the same thing with them as they had come out of this slavery and into, and again, I'm like y'all, I think, how could they see all these things and not remember what he's done for them? But you have to put yourself in their shoes, and I think that's real tough for us to do because we've had pretty coddled lives. If we wanted to be a Christian, we got to be a Christian. And so I try not to be, again, too hard on them, but God's saying, no, I'm done. We're done. So Moses does what? He's done it before and he does it again.
Is there anything new today?
There's not anything new today, is there? Well, I don't know, maybe spaceships and stuff like that, but not the temptation and the sin and there's nothing new about man, is there? About the way we think and the way we react.
I'm sitting here thinking, there's all sorts of spiritual lessons from this, because they were in slavery, in freedom, performed all sorts of miracles. And they continually forget the blessing. I mean, they had manna that morning, probably. They're continually forgetful of the actions of God. And they prefer, at least what's coming out of their mouths, they prefer slavery again. We actually see that in non-Christians that don't want us to escape their lifestyle. They know they should probably be with God, but they can't leave the slavery that they're involved with. So, there's all sorts of spiritual lessons there. And you're right, people haven't changed much because, self-incrimination, how forgetful are we? We don't have the big miracle things that happen, but the provision of God and the answers to prayer, we see all the time. And yet sometimes our first reaction is, man, I can't do that.
And it's because the first part of that sentence there,
Well,
I can't.
Yeah, it's a lack of faith that's, and that part hasn't changed.
And so you've done a great job of jumping ahead for me again. Y'all are good at jumping ahead. Yes, sir.
It has a lot to do with being thankful in all things. It's taken me a long time to be thankful that God can bless somebody through me. Because that's not so pleasant for me in all these instances. But the thankful part of it, I'm still working on that because that's tough in all circumstances. And I think we've seen that here. There's a lack of thankfulness in everything he's done, and it shows in how they act.
Well, nobody today is entitled at all, are they? We're all grateful for everything we have. Right? Sorry, that's sarcasm flowing out of me.
I have a question about verse 10. The whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then Did God interrupt Moses, Aaron, Caleb, Joshua from being killed?
It appears that way, doesn't it? So we see this negativity creep in. We see this mob mentality hit. And they are about to stone the positive people. They're about to say, you know what? Y'all are nuts and you're going to get us killed, so we're just going to take you out. And then we're going to have, what would they have done if they had killed Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua? They would have headed back into the wilderness towards Egypt.
Probably without food.
Without food to run away, and they would have perished.
I think they would turn on each other.
Yeah. And so while God said, I'm going to do away with these people, he did step in verse 10. Who's the good guy in this story? So we talk about the bad guys, and we think Caleb and Joshua are the good guys, but the good guy in this story is God, because he steps in, he says, no, you're not going to do that to these people that are standing for me. Which there's a lesson in that too, isn't there? That God takes care of us. And that doesn't mean that we're going to have everything peachy keen. That doesn't mean we won't die. But when you do God's will, he protects you, doesn't he? In the end, we win. We know that. We know that. And so here he does exactly what you said. He steps in and saves those people. And so, because we're about out of time, the story goes that God talks with Moses. Moses talks through this thing, and God says, okay, Moses, you're right. What if Moses had said, hey, that's great. Make the sins out of me. I'm tired of these people.
I'm sure there's some days coming.
I'm sure you're right. So Moses talks through this. Moses talks through this, and God says, okay, I'm going to let them live. But here's what's going to happen, and this is what we talked about earlier. This is why they have to wander for 40 years. For every, I think for every day that you were spying, when you came back, you're going to spend a year wandering. If you're above 20 years old, you're unfaithful, you're not going in. You were afraid to do you didn't put your trust in me, you're not going in. And you 10, you got the plague. I'm done with y'all. You're not leaders for me anymore. And they died of the plague right there. And so we see the results of faithlessness. And if we had a lot of time, we would go into Hebrews and look at chapter 3, where God talks. Actually, let's read that. That'll be our parting. It's better to part with the word than it is with me. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 3, verses 8 through 12. So Hebrews chapter 3, verses 8 through 12. And this relates directly back to our story today. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, in the days of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Verse 12, beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. So we see right there what God thinks about a heart of unbelief. And so it's not just the Israelites in the wilderness, but God tells us right there, if you're a man or a woman of unbelief, you need to fix that, because God puts up with a lot of things, doesn't he? And we can talk about all these characters that we've talked about for, 10 weeks now, or however long it's been. But when does God finally say, okay, I'm done? What did he say with the Israelites? When does he say, I'm done with you? At what point?
They don't believe.
It's unbelief, isn't it? It's disbelief. It is when you do not believe in him. And the beauty of it is, and we know this, we can always come back. God still allows that, and he even in this story allows it, doesn't it? But there are consequences for that disbelief, that unbelief. And I think that we can even see that in Hebrew. So I've taken a couple minutes past the bell, since there is no bell, but I appreciate your attendance this morning and your participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So where's the scripture where there were others besides?
It's Numbers.
Good week.